Welcome to one and all this evening. Very much appreciate the fact that you're giving up some of your valuable free time in what I can only imagine has been a very busy and hectic and very strange start to the term. So on behalf of ISMLA, you're very welcome to this first webinar from a series of webinars that we're putting on during the autumn. My role in the ISMLA committee is as prep schools liaison. However, as testament to the fact that we've got colleagues from both prep schools and secondary school settings, this first session that Suzi is very kindly leading for us on phonics truly is that all-phase theme, or is an all-phase theme. So I'm delighted that we're starting with something that can be relevant in terms of both prep schools and senior schools. As you'll be probably aware, Suzi is a very experienced MFL teacher and also teacher trainer, having led the PGCE at York University up till 2015. She is in the classroom still, so very much everything she talks about, she's not just talking the talk, but walking the walk as well. And she also runs her own successful consultancy, Polyglot Languages. So lots of strings to Suzi's bow. So absolutely, as I say, delighted that we can launch this evening with our phonics session. If I could just ask, just as a bit of a plug at the beginning of this session, as I said, my role is very much about promoting the prep dimension within the ISMLA committee. So do please pass that message far and wide to your colleagues, both within ISMLA schools that may have prep or junior sections, but also to any independent schools that you're aware of that are not part of ISMLA as yet, prep schools as well. Do please pass that message that we are very much open to business and positively recruiting for new prep school members. But that's my plug over and done with anyway. And let's move swiftly on to what we're all here for this evening, which is to hear from Suzi. So I'm going to pass back to you, Suzi. And as I say, please do make use of that chat function, and we will have an opportunity at the end to answer any questions. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Guy. That's great. Well, I think there may well be one or two more pings as we go, as we allow people into the meeting, but hopefully you will not be too distracted by that. So as Guy very kindly introduced me, my name is Suzi Bewell, and I am very much a classroom teacher, but my background is also teacher education. And back in early 2010, I did some work for the then Links into Languages. So I was still a classroom practitioner at the time, about to take on my role at the University of York. And I had a real sort of classroom interest in phonics, and two very young school-age children at the time. And I wanted to look at what they were doing in their English classrooms and see whether that might feed into what I was doing in my languages classrooms. So I wrote the 10-minute guide to accelerating language learning, which you can find on the Times Educational website. And if I just open up my presentation now, you'll see that there is a link on the very bottom there, which will take you directly to the presentation, sorry, to the document. So tonight's presentation, and it's lovely to be here. I've been in isolation for the last couple of weeks as a colleague of mine tested positive, so it's lovely to be around people again. So we're going to be talking about how you can accelerate language learning using phonics. If post presentation you would like to get in touch with me, do feel free to send me a tweet or contact me via my website. My email contact details are here, and they will appear again on the final slide. And as I said earlier, for those of you who may be joined a little bit later, a copy of the presentation will be sent to you along with a recording. We are video recording the session so that you can share that more widely with your colleagues in your department back in school. I'm not entirely sure where that will be hosted yet, but we'll send details through to you as soon as we have that information. So I think the session outline for this evening, I'm just going to give you a very brief introduction about why I personally believe that there is a need for the overt teaching of phonics in the foreign languages classroom. And then I'm going to split it into two parts. The first part is the biggest section, really, about decoding in the second foreign language. And probably from a practical perspective, the bit that you're most interested in is ideas to take away and use immediately in the classroom. And then I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how we can use technology, which we're all becoming more and more familiar with, to take our learning into the 21st century. So this is an extract from an Ofsted document which was published in 2004. And it says, across all phases, speaking is the least well developed of all the skills, and students' inability to be able to say what they want to say in a new language has a negative impact on their confidence and enthusiasm. Several students said that being able to say what they wanted to say would improve their enjoyment. And I think we've all taught students where that's probably been the case. Fast forward to 2011, so more recently, too much speaking still relied on writing. And I think, again, we know from experience that when a student writes down a beautiful script in a foreign language, quite often how they translate that in their head into the spoken word isn't necessarily as fluent or as French, Spanish, German speaking as we might like. And then the second quote from there is where students didn't understand the conventions between sounds and spelling, commonly known as sound spelling links. Pronunciation and reading were often weak and a barrier to communication. And I've put the link at the bottom there if you want to read the whole document. So essentially, it was reassuring to me at the time because it made me realise that actually it wasn't just happening in my foreign languages classroom. In 2010, I took on the PGCE course director role for modern languages at York. And with my training teachers, we looked in quite a lot of depth at the then Key Stage 3 framework for languages. So this sat alongside the national curriculum document. It wasn't a compulsory document, so it's something that was set out as guidance. But interestingly, again, that one of the strands running through that document for Key Stage 3 was referring to letters and sounds. So this is starting to appear in government documentation. Let me just check that we've got everybody in. I'm just going to let a couple more people in. If we home in on that document, it says, specifically for Year 7, applying knowledge of common letter strings, sound patterns, accents, and other characters. For Year 8, identifying and recalling common exceptions to the rule. And as we know, specifically in French, there are lots of exceptions to the rule, unfortunately. And in Year 9, identifying specific function or meaning of some letter strings. So it sets out quite clearly what should be done at different stages of learning in Key Stage 3. Now for Key Stage 2, if you're familiar with the framework for languages for Key Stage 2, interestingly again, that the expectation now that languages are compulsory in Key Stage 2 is that we look at things like language learning strategies, knowledge about language, we focus in on high frequency words, we try and give the students the skills to read aloud with confidence. And actually, when sometimes we only have 30 minutes to an hour a week to do that, that's quite a big ask. But nonetheless, it is still within key government documentation. Have to say that phonics isn't a new thing. I'll leave you to read this to yourselves, but back in 1964, this came up in a document that I found in the American Association of Teachers of French. And again, the issues are still there, how to help students with their pronunciation and in turn with their spelling. And the idea that if it is only done very light touch and not as a staple part of our as our teaching, that it perhaps won't have the impact that we would like it to have. Depending on when you train to teach languages, so I trained back in 1999 at Trinity and All Saints College, it was very much about communicative language teaching. And here it says, in the early stage of learning, the written form of the language can interfere with pronunciation. Learners need ample opportunities to listen and respond before the written forms are involved. And that was very much the methodology or the way of teaching languages that I trained under. And I would say that things have moved on hugely since then, because actually, if we look at the French examples at the bottom of the slide, how often do we hear students pronouncing things like lapin instead of lapin? They pronounce the H, the aspirate H in habit. They say things like les maths, famille, because they don't know the rule about ILLE in French. They say things like quart instead of quart, and I'm not even going to try and attempt to say how they might pronounce the last word, wazoo. So lots of food for thought there. Jo Rees-Jones, who some of you might be aware of, is a primary practitioner down in Hampshire. And on her blog, which is called Talk About Primary MFL, she sort of piqued my interest, if you like, when I started to look at this in my own practice. And the question that sort of prompted me to act really was, children don't arrive at primary magically knowing how to read in English. They are taught. So why do we imagine they will learn to read another language if we don't first teach them the code? So I was interested in thinking about what is this code? And having been a learner of French for over 20 years at that point, nobody had really taught me personally the code or how to decode French. But then I was one of those keen learners who I'm imagining just picked it up automatically. So lots and lots out there, pointing in the direction of phonics being a really useful tool to help students read aloud more accurately and with better fluency. So as we're in an online forum, it's not going to be possible to discuss amongst ourselves, but just have a think about this prompt question, really. Hilary McCall is a languages expert who has done a lot of work on supporting students with special educational needs and disabilities. And she's quoted as saying, if we fail to teach phonics, we're condemning many of our learners to be quasi-dyslexic in the foreign language. Now, this often sparks quite a reaction from delegates because it's quite a strong view. And I think I've picked it intentionally because actually I want to try and put across the point that, some students do really struggle with reading and speaking in a foreign language. And actually, when they are beginners and it's the first time that they've encountered a foreign language, it can sometimes feel the way that a dyslexic reader might feel, in the sense that the letter strings don't make the same sounds as they might do in their first language. So it's just something to think about, really. So I can't see you on the screen, but I'm imagining you nodding and shaking your heads. Some of you, I guess, don't really teach phonics at the moment. And what I mean by that is how to pronounce the language, but you perhaps don't overtly do it. You might do it as and when something crops up. This was certainly my experience. How many times do students learn something by heart, perhaps for their GCSE speaking presentation, and it sounds dreadful? Perhaps this is you. I feel it'd be more useful to come into year 7 with a knowledge of certain sounds rather than knowing about the weather or pets. And maybe, as we said earlier, taking more of a skills-based approach to language learning lower down the school, as opposed to just knowing lots of lists of vocabulary. And then I learned Spanish quite recently as an adult learner, and it was a really good experience for me in the sense that it taught me, or it reminded me, how difficult it is to be an early language learner, to be in the very early stages of learning the language. So we're going to have a look in a bit more detail about what this code might look like in the second foreign language, and then I'm going to quickly move on to the practical ideas. So back in 2008, when I was still in the classroom, I was teaching French and German at the time at All Saints Language College in York. And a specific group that I taught year 8, they were beginners. I did a bit of pupil voice with them to try and kind of gauge where they were at with their pronunciation, with their spoken French. And these were some of the things that they were saying. So they had an awareness of silent letters, but they sometimes found that hard to remember. The fact that the language sounded very different to the way that it's spelt. Some of them also had Spanish as a second language. So Spanish, generally speaking, you pronounce things as you see them. And they forget about how to pronounce and struggle. So it wasn't a particularly positive picture. So as I say, my children at the time were primary school age. They were coming home talking to me about split digraphs and trigraphs. And I have to admit, even as a linguist, I had to do a bit of research of my own to find out what they were talking about. So here we have got a lady who was famous in the 50s in France called Suzi Bewell, and she at the time came up with a gesticular method, which was used predominantly with students who had special educational needs. But you can see, those of you who are perhaps familiar with Jolly Phonics, that it's a very similar technique. So each sound related to a gesture. And so that got me thinking about what else is actually going on in France. How do native French speakers teach their native French children French as a foreign language? Do they home in on the pronunciation? And so I came across a number of useful websites. This one, Petit Pas, for example. I came across one called La Planète des Alphas, which again was really interesting to just get a sense of how French native children are taught the pronunciation and phonics of their language. Those of you who are familiar with the Catherine Cheetah primary scheme of work might have come across this book, which is part of the scheme. It's called Méthode de lecture pour apprendre à lire pas à pas. And this was the first sort of dipping in the toes that I had of sort of introducing my students systematically to how to pronounce French. I then stumbled on Amazon upon Le Manuel Phonique, which to my understanding isn't available in any other language apart from French, but I'll show you in just a second. There is lots and lots of free material out there in any number of languages. But what I thought was interesting about this is that the methodology that I'd been seeing my own primary age children coming home using to help them with learning how to read and write and sound letters out in English was actually being translated into a French technique as well. So if you want to join in, please feel free, but I'm going to do this for you, and hopefully you can see the video. So the idea for each of the sounds is that they have an associated image. So in the case of S or S, the action says bouger la main comme un serpent qui rampe en formant un S et dit S. So what I would do with the students is I would form the S shape and I would say serpent, sable, aussi, nounours, classe. And we would go through one at a time. You might notice on the slide that one or two of the final letters of the words are in faint. And this is something that I actually do in my own teaching. So when there is a silent letter, if most of the word appears in bold, to indicate that the letter is silent, it isn't in bold, so that the students can see visually that it need not be pronounced. For A in English, the gesture is A for ant. In French is acrobate, and here it says tournez la main en rond comme un acrobate qui s'élance dans l'air et dit a a a. So here again we've got acrobate, avion, ami, papa, and ananas, although I'm sure some of you would argue that it is ananas. T, we've got tennis as the key sound. We've got manger and subsequent words. This is a favourite with younger children. They like to do the rubbing of the tummy motion. And then I for souris. And this is a nice one. So you do the I gesture where you make a little, make a gesture around your nose for the I noise that a souris might make. And then you've got igloo, il, ici, and midi. And there is a really logical order. So if you look halfway down the list of words for the L sound, you'll see that there is lion. And here, quite often, the children will say lion when you ask them to read it out from what they see on the screen. And at that point, I would make the mouse sign, which is the I for souris, and that would just remind them that it isn't lion, as they might expect it to be, because they've been used to that word for most of their lives in their first language, but that it's actually more of an E sound, as in lion. Okay. Now, when I was a lead practitioner with the Specialist Schools and Academies Trust, I took this idea of pronunciation out into the wider sort of MFL community. And I also had the opportunity to look at what other colleagues were doing up and down the country, because I don't think I was the only person starting to think, well, actually, if phonics is appearing in government documentation, maybe we need to be spending a bit more time focusing on this. So Steph Reed came up with her own version of the Jolie Phonique. And again, each of these sounds, and these are some of the trickier sounds in French, I think you'll see, has an action. Quite a lot of them are linked to animals, which I think for younger learners is fun. But what I tend to do when I pick my own words to link to certain tricky sounds is I actually hand over the ownership to the students. So we actually come up with the action together so that they have chosen the action. Most of the actions tend to be the same for every class, but some students do choose quite unusual actions depending on what they want to say. This version is with thanks to Rachel Hawkes, who I'm sure many of you will have come across on the training circuits. So her version in Spanish, which is actually part of the NSELP project, which is currently coming out of York University. Lots and lots of work being done there in French, German and Spanish around phonics. So that's definitely worth looking at for a comprehensive scheme that actually incorporates this. And just a link there to some more of Rachel's work. If you go into the section on Rachel Hawkes' website, there is actually a primary section, and you can download for both French and Spanish. I don't know that there's a German section. A scheme of work for primary languages, which actually incorporates Spanish as phonics as one of the first 2 or 3 lessons within the scheme of learning. So I would definitely recommend taking a look at that. This is a German version. That I have to say there isn't as much for German in terms of phonics out there, but perhaps if there are enough of us on the call who are interested in that, that's something that could be developed over time. But this is a similar example of, again, some of those key sounds in German, each sound being linked to an image and each image being linked to a gesture. If any of you have ever done any training with Wendy Adeniji, you might have come across this resource, which is Les Planètes Phoniques is the version that I have, but it also is available in Spanish and German. I think going back a number of years, it cost me in the region of £50 to purchase this, but it is a really, really good resource. And if technology will allow, I'm just going to share this screen. I'm hoping that you can see my internet browser now. We've looked at quite a lot of French for now, so I think we're going to have a look at the the Spanish lesson. So this is from Planetas Fonéticos. I can't get my Spanish out this evening. And this is just a sample to show you what a phonics lesson might look like. Okay, so just allow that to open. I've also given you a link to where the, it doesn't appear to be there. Just let me stop sharing for a second and see. Ah, there we go. It has appeared and I've just managed to close it. Here we go. Okay, I think that might be somebody else trying to get in. I'll just let them in. Okay. Can you see the Planet Phonics? I don't know that you can. Every time I click on there. Right, let me just see if I can open that. I think we might have to come back to that. So if you just bear with me, I'll show you that at the end. It doesn't seem to want to go forward. Right, let me come back into the presentation and share my screen again. Sorry about that. Right, I think we've got the Planet Phonics slide. Can you just give me a nod, Guy, if you can see the, can you think of any words with the sound?
Can you think of any words with a h sounding?
Okay, so the lesson might start with the question, what words do you already know? Let's look at prior learning. And then we get quite a dramatic entry of the letter of the planet J.
El planeta.
Okay, so there are planets for each of the different tricky sounds in Spanish. So we're going to look at some of the key sounds.
Naranja, conejo, junio, julio, rojo. Ojos.
So those are maybe some of the beginner words that you might encounter that contain the ch sound. So you're going to listen to a rhyme next. We're going to talk about rhymes and tongue twisters. So I want you to count, even if you're not a Spanish speaker, how many times you can hear the ch sound. And what I normally get the students to do is show me their hands, and each time they hear one, they can just put a finger up or down to show me that they're joining in.
Vengan a ver mi granja, vengan todos. Vengan a ver mi granja que es hermosa. Y el perro hace así. ¡Wow! 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 Vengan a ver mi granja, vengan todos. Vengan a ver mi granja que es hermosa. Y la vaca hace así. ¡Mu! ¡Mu!
Okay. So the second time of hearing, you would actually present the students with the word. so they can make a connection between the sound and the spelling.
Vengan a ver mi granja, vengan todos. Vengan a ver mi granja que es hermosa. Y el perro hace así. ¡Wow! 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 Vengan a ver mi granja, vengan todos. Vengan a ver mi granja, que es hermosa. Y la vaca hace así. ¡Mu! ¡Mu!
Okay, and then at that point we would look at where the h sounds are and how many we counted up in total. Okay, then I would encourage the students, now they're a bit more familiar with the sound, to try one of these tongue
En un
twisters.
juncal de Junqueira, juncos juntaba Julián. Juntóse Juan a juntarlos y juntos juncos juntaron.
Oh, that's a tricky one.
Jorge, el cerrajero, vende cerrajes en la cerrajería.
Okay. Now you might have students wanting to know what the meaning is, and that's absolutely fine. But for the purposes of this activity, it's absolutely fine to say the meaning isn't so important. It's about just trying to get our mouths and our tongues around the specific sounds of the language. And then towards the end of the lesson, or the part of the lesson that's going to focus around phonics, I would then be tempted to sort of informally assess where the students are at, whether we're perhaps confident to move on to the next sound, by seeing if actually they can pronounce some more quite high frequency familiar words that perhaps they haven't come across before, but because we've done lots of practice, quite overt practice of that specific sound, are they then able to say these words aloud? And I would turn that to the students.
Hijo, jamón, jersey, jirafa, México, Jorge.
Okay, and that's the end of that for now. So that's a Spanish example. If I share my screen back with you again, just come back to the, just got too many screens open at once. If you click on the link within the presentation, the training for learning, that will take you to the website, and you can have a little look, if you would like to, at an example for the W sound in French and the tricky W sound in German. So just as a bit of an overview before we go into more of the specifics of what it might look like in a lesson. So hopefully that's given you a little bit of a taster of what sorts of activities you could do in a classroom. I think for me, it is very much about being overt in the teaching of sounds. I think prior to what you might have been taught on your PGCE, if it was sort of prior to the early 2000s, I do definitely advocate linking sound to spelling and showing the written word as much as possible. I think a lot of students really benefit from that. I think it's really important to ask colleagues to share good practice, to challenge pupils to think about the difficulties of English pronunciation, think about their own language and how difficult that might be for someone studying English as their foreign language. I think one thing I've done certainly since the sort of early 2010 is look through my scheme of work and try and preempt poor pronunciation. So if I go through the vocabulary and the grammatical structures that I'm likely to teach, having taught now for 20 years, I think I know where the kind of problem words and problem sounds are. So I can highlight those and actually think, okay, which of those sounds seems to be recurring in this unit of work, and where would it make most sense during my scheme of learning to actually incorporate that into my teaching. And then I think next, before we move on, just supporting pupils to better understand the foreign language that they are working with, be that French, Spanish or German. And really it's about helping them to feel successful, helping them to improve and crack the code, and where possible trying to do that in a fun and engaging way. So I'm going to look now at some simple and effective ways that you might be able to do this in your classroom setting. And obviously, I suppose I need the caveat that in a COVID world, or in the current climate, there probably are some activities that I'm going to suggest that might not necessarily be possible at the current time. But hopefully you will all take away a good raft of ideas. It's just that perhaps some of them might need to be saved for a future date. Okay, so looking at what progress in phonics looks like, with the younger learners, so we're talking about our pre-prep students, I think it's quite normal to just expect them to hear and identify sounds. So it might be that I pick out 2 different sounds and they have to do a specific action when they hear one sound, and they do a completely different action when they hear the other. The next step in terms of progress would be to repeat and produce the sound. Practicing the sound as much as possible in different contexts, distinguishing the sounds. So if there are 2 sounds that are quite similar, are students able to make the difference between those 2 sounds? Moving on to linking the graphemes to the sounds, so the grapheme, the written representation of the word, and then finally moving to syllables and word level and sentence level. So some of you might recognize this, the Boursin advert. I'm going to attempt to click on the link and show you the clip. So as a starter, I might be tempted to use a video clip like this one to pull out a specific phoneme. So I'm going to play this for you and see if you can work out what the phoneme in question is. Is that going to work? Oh, that's it. And then the slightly twisted ending there, du tracteur. And so that would obviously be the sound. I'm just going to let somebody else in. So coming back to the PowerPoint, just move forward on that one. And I would then probably be tempted to see if there are other words in French that the students are familiar with that contain that sound, perhaps any number sounds or animal sounds. 4 corners flashcards, when we are in a position where we're allowed to have our students out of their seats, is a really fun game. So for example, I might choose the grapheme cards for wa, un, ou, and I. And when I say a phoneme, the pupils have to move. So depending on the size of space that you have, they could walk or run to the corner of the classroom where they think that that visual representation is. I would then probably progress to the teacher saying words containing the relevant graphemes. And certainly in French, I think lots of the tricky sounds appear in the numbers 1 to 20. So that's always a really good way of starting out with phonics in French, in my experience. And then once the pupils grow in confidence, certainly the students that I teach quite like to be teacher. And so it would then maybe be an opportunity to ask one of them to offer up words of their own choosing. This video I'm just going to skip over just because of time. This is a video by a website called Paris by Pod. And this is somebody who has videoed themselves, the front of their face and then the side angle, so that actually when you are teaching the students the tricky sounds using the numbers 1 to 20, that they can actually see for themselves how the mouth moves in a very specific way when you're speaking French or Spanish or German. This one here, which is a Spanish example, and as I said, you'll get the presentation at the end. This links all of the different sounds in Spanish to different animals, and again is quite a good way of buying in younger students. With my year 9s, I had a year 9 quite low ability, not particularly keen German set, and we had good fun. This was an idea that I took from the DCSF Letters and Sounds Guide, which is linked there in the hyperlink. And one of the ideas from that was actually to get the students to look at themselves in plastic mirrors so that they can actually see for themselves what their mouth is doing. And you might get them, for example, with cognates, to pronounce a word in English and then pronounce the same word in French or Spanish or German, and just get them to really vocalize what their mouth, their tongue, their teeth are doing differently when they say the word in the foreign accent. A phonics train, again, this one would require quite a large space or certainly room where the students can get up out of their seats. But preparing sets of grapheme cards and then giving the students a card, so one from a choice of 6, I think normally works well. And the students walk around the room calling out the correct phoneme and listening out for others with the same sound. And what they would do is form 6 separate trains, if you like, and then repeat all of the different sounds as a class at varying speeds. What I like about this activity is that it's a really quick starter. As with many of these ideas, it takes minimal preparation. And I think when the opportunity lends itself to that, it is great for the students to be out of their seats, but obviously not in the current climate, sadly. We looked at this in a little bit of detail earlier when we talked about the resources from Wendy Adeniji, the Planète Phonique resources. So songs, poems, rhymes, tongue twisters all lend themselves really well to working on the sounds of the language. It could be for a gap fill activity, which focuses on sound rather than meaning. More often than not, when I do use a song in a languages lesson, it tends to be for the students to either fill in the gaps or pick out specific vocabulary items. But there's nothing to say that you can't just put a slightly different slant on that activity and maybe recycle the song and do it more for a sound lesson as opposed to a meaning. Blanking out the rhyming words, I'll show you an example of that in a second. Having the pupils read out a poem or a song words to themselves and using the rhymes to fill in the gaps. More and more, I think it's World Poetry Day, is it today in fact? Volunteers read a completed version of a poem. So actually going back to that tradition of having students go home and learn poetry or song lyrics off by heart, I think again gives them a really good opportunity to focus in on their pronunciation. And a couple of other examples that you might want to have a look at in your own time. If any of you have been around teaching for a while, you will probably recognise this song from the Mary Glasgow Chanterelle CD. I think it is still in circulation. This one I really like because it means that we get to play around with our own names. So the first verse, for example, j'ai un copain qui s'appelle Roland. Roland, il est comment? Roland est intelligent. And then what we would go on to do is look at the female versions of Sarah, rhyming with Sampa. And then if, for example, in the class there was a Josh, we could rhyme that with Mosh and look at how the spellings are different in the first language to the second language. Jo, il est beau, Li est petit. When I first started teaching, I was Mademoiselle Hamnet, and I always used to get Mademoiselle Hamnet, elle est bête. And then when I got married and I became Madame Bewell, it was Madame Bewell, elle est cool. So I think I prefer being Madame Bewell. This is something that actually came to my attention just a couple of days ago as I was looking for ideas for World Poetry Day. So this is a colleague called Marie-Odile who has, again, been focusing quite strongly in her languages lessons on phonics. She is a French native speaker. And she's looking at animals. It's quite early on in the school term, so that's quite a typical topic perhaps for some of our younger learners. And she has created some poems of her own, which she has posted very kindly on the primary languages in primary school Facebook page, and also she has a YouTube channel which I'm more than happy to share with you. Tongue twisters again are a great way of having students go away and find interesting texts that kind of grab them more for the sound than for the meaning. Lots and lots of examples in French. Chien et chat chantent. Un bon chasseur est un chasseur sachant chasser sans son chien. That was a tricky one. But also in lots of other languages. In German, Zungenbrecher. In Spanish, Trabalenguas. We've got a couple of examples there. And if, for example, you were preparing for European Day of Languages, or you've perhaps got students in your school who have got languages outside of the traditional European languages, there's a really useful link at the bottom there to where you can find tongue twisters in 117 different languages, including some of the less commonly spoken ones. So that, again, I think is a really nice way to really help the children to get their tongues around the different words. If you're fortunate to have a reasonably sized budget, you might be able to buy those plastic dice where you slot in the different picture cards, for example, when you're teaching a specific topic. But I came across a website called Tools for Educators, not just there to print out ready-made dice so the students can make these perhaps for their prep. But if you go onto the different teaching websites, you can actually buy ready-made dice with those little plastic pockets. And there's some examples there of the fans that I'm going to talk about, the phonics fans, and then even a little strip of card where the students just use a peg to indicate what the letter sound is that they hear in a specific context. On senteacher.org, you can buy these things ready-made. They cost a small fortune. What I found is that actually to run up a set of these for myself, either on card or just to laminate them, is far more cost effective. So phonics fans, again, reading out different words and the students holding up the correct fan according to which specific sound they hear in context. So yeah, distributing the fans with up to perhaps 10 common sounds. When the teacher says a sound, the pupils hold up the corresponding card. You could then, with perhaps older learners, move on to monosyllabic words. And so, for example, it could be with animal names in French. So it might be Alain, le lapin, Lucie, la gorille, and so on, just to give you a couple of examples there. I came across a really dry but good book in French, which talks about all the different exceptions in the French language. And this one really struck me because quite often, even in the sixth form, students still insist on pronouncing famille, famille. And I think the reason for that is because one of the key words they recognize is ville. So we often say dans ma ville, you know, il y a un cinéma and so on. But actually the rule for il in terms of pronunciation is that mille, ville and tranquille are the only three words, along with their variations, where you actually pronounce the il sound in French. Now, I wish I'd known that at school because that would have made my life an awful lot easier, but just trying to find little tricks and tips like that where the students have got something to grab onto to help them when it comes to any exceptions that might exist. Students absolutely love cognates. They love them because they look like the English, but as Heather Rendell points out here, if it looks like English, it will not sound like English. And what I might do, for example, and this is taken from Martine Pilet's Zappi lesson starters for Key Stage 3, is just do a little activity when I'm doing food and drink, for example, so focus again on the phonics, and ask the students, à votre avis, est-ce que je préfère les raviolis ou les pizzas? So there I've actually put in brackets the silent letters, and you'll see on the example with les oranges, I've put a line linking the liaison between the S and the O, again, to indicate really clearly on any worksheets and handouts or slides that I present to the children, that if it's got a bracket around it, it's generally silent. We talk a lot about silent letters. And if it has a line linking two separate letters together, like the S and the O of les oranges, it's because you need to make that liaison, which again is quite a tricky aspect of French. You might want to play Phonics Bingo. I've uploaded all of these cards if you follow that link to the Times Educational Supplement website. And I've also done quite a bit of working around the most commonly used words in French, so high frequency words. It's interesting that within the top 20 most commonly used words in French, that many of them contain final silent consonants. So it really is important that we highlight that from an early stage. I'm going to gloss over this slightly, but again, if you are interested in doing a bit more research into the importance of high frequency language, then Val Thornber, who is most famous for her website Grow Story Grow, is somebody to look into in a bit more detail. But I think that the headline figure there, the 100 most common words, actually make up about 50% of the material that we read, and the 25 most common words make up about a third of our written material. So if we are focusing dominantly on those high frequency words, then we are doing a good service to our students. Yellowdoor.net is a website a little bit like Yorkshire Purchasing Organisation, where you can buy various vests and kind of paraphernalia, like you can see on the screen here. But I use these for lots of different activities, for spelling out words, for ordering different pictures into sentences. They're not particularly cheap, but for an inexpensive alternative, you could just print out a set of the cards and use a washing line or a string with pegs. Meg Mystique or Mystic Meg, predicting correct spelling. So at the moment in my school, we aren't allowed to use mini whiteboards, or we have to disinfect them and leave them for 48 hours before we can redistribute them. So this might be something to put on hold for now. But the teacher reads out some short, simple words, and they listen and use their knowledge of the phonemes and graphemes to predict the correct spelling. So essentially, it's a little bit like a dictation, as an extension for maybe older learners going into Key Stage 3 and 4, having them use their phonic awareness to spell out longer and more tricky words and sentences. On the Times Educational website, again, I came across this activity, Spot the Common Sounds game. This could be quite a nice starter. So in the top left, we've got the sh for chat, chemise, chapeau, and chateau. In the top right, we have got ce for serpent, cinq, ça va, and France. And you get the idea. Noughts and Crosses, we also play as a kind of staple activity, not just for vocabulary recognition, but dividing the students into 2 teams, presenting them with 9 graphemes via your interactive whiteboard or just your whiteboard, writing them on the whiteboard. The teacher says the phoneme, and then I normally give them fly swats, or it could just be a feather duster, and a volunteer from Team A and a volunteer from Tier B compete to see who can locate the corresponding grapheme first. And that, as we mentioned earlier, could perhaps progress to a game of 4 corners flashcards when our students are allowed out of their seats again. Venn diagrams, or what I call the hula hoop activity. This again is a good one if you've got quite a good space, if you're teaching in pre-prep, for example, and you've got quite a big classroom. The graphemes are represented by different hoops. You could label the hoops with a different grapheme card, and then the overlap of the hoops is there to create a physical Venn diagram. So for example, if you had the EI and the IE sound, which is quite tricky in German, you could have students put words containing the E sound in one side, words that contain the I sound in another side, and anywhere there's an overlap, like the word 41, they would have to put in the middle. If there is a lack of space, it could be done on paper. So using the classtools.net website, which I use pretty much most weeks in my teaching, lots of really good free templates on there. This is an example of what it might look like laid out on the ground. So as you can see, 1, 2, and 3 on the left-hand side, 44 and 44 in the right, and then down the middle, 41, 34, and 73 in the middle, because they have an overlap there. I think somebody might have dipped out there. Let me just admit them. We've got Happy Families, which is a free game, which you could download using the link there. So looking at different words that contain the different sounds, and again, a very typical sort of French board game. At the moment, I'm not teaching in any one classroom. I am circulating around the school, so I don't currently have a classroom to display these posters, but we do often display posters that contain grammatical constructions, classroom language, useful vocabulary, and I would suggest that it's also useful to display posters to assist the students with their pronunciation. Looking at the next slide, can you spot the odd one out? And this I think I've picked because the E sound in French is spelled in so many different ways. But I don't know if you can see where my mouse is going just now, but we have got danse. And the reason I have put that there is because even again in the 6th form, students still don't realise that the N and the T ending is silent. So again, using a Wordle, for example, like that is quite a nice way of highlighting some of the intricacies of your language. This one, I tend to make up a little story on the spot. The students listen to a short story or a song. And every time they hear a particular phoneme, they have to either do a little wave, they can stand up out of their seats, or what I quite often do at the moment, because we can't do very much movement, is just a simple Mexican wave. So if you want to join in, please do. So every time you hear the "un" sound, I want you to give me either a little wave or a Mexican wave. So, je m'appelle Vincent et j'ai 25 ans. J'habite en Inde et à mon avis, je suis très intelligent. À la maison, j'ai un lapin et 2 pingouins. Je suis mince. Mon repas préféré, c'est de la dinde et j'aime boire du vin. Le week-end, je fais du patin et j'y vais en train. La fin. So again, every time they hear that sound, training their ear to just listen out for that specific sound is really fun, and I think quite engaging. Okay, so lots and lots of ideas there. Hopefully lots of take homes that you can do without very much preparation or prior planning. Just a couple of slides here about how I use technology to good effect. So in my classroom as a staple, I often use these recordable talking postcards. They do only record up to 10 seconds of sound, so they're not quite as effective as the little talking point buttons or the Easy Speak microphones. But again, just finding different and creative ways of children wanting to engage in speaking as an activity. Most iPads and mobile phones contain video recording equipment, but back in the early days of recording students, I would often use one of these mini cameras which have got a built-in USB. They record for up to 1 to 2 hours, and again, just to try and capture some of those brilliant moments where the students are actually using their phonic awareness and their speaking skills, giving them a real reason to want to do a good job with their spoken work. With my current sixth form, I use this quite a lot because we are a little bit limited as the way in which we can do speaking activities in class at the moment. So what I get them to do is go on to vocaroo.com, and they just log on with a headset that's got a mouthpiece. So most of them have them belonging to their mobile phones, and they don't need a password or a username. They just literally go on to vocaroo.com. They record their voice. There is a playback facility, so it allows them to self-correct, or if they don't like the version that they've recorded, they can record it again. And then they're given the option to send it to a friend, so they would send it to their teacher work email, and that also gives the opportunity for speaking for homework, which I think particularly if we enter into another period of self-isolation could be quite useful, because I think certainly lots of my colleagues have said that they focus predominantly on reading and writing skills in isolation, because actually without any live lessons or without the teacher input, it's quite difficult to focus on speaking. So just a few final thoughts before I take any questions. If you think back to the pupil voice that I took back in the autumn term 2008, it wasn't a particularly pleasant picture. Everything was hard, it was difficult, and they were forgetting the pronunciation. Fast forward to the following year, so the summer term, having spent an awful lot of time and energy focusing on phonics, when I interviewed the children again, 65% of them enjoyed and found the work on pronunciation helpful. One of them said, I'd like to read more stories aloud. They were actually asking to speak more. Everyone should do a podcast, so they all wanted to be involved in recording their voices. The blog is like work but more fun, so our school blog was where I hosted some of their podcasts. We actually created a kind of fake radio station called Ruspif Radio, and essentially all it was just little videos and that they'd done in class. One of them said, I wish I'd had chance to do the podcast, and I think the one that made my day, can we do more speaking work? A friend of mine over in Lancashire, who's an MFL teacher and also PGC tutor, reported back having attended one of my courses and implemented some of the changes. I cracked the code of my year 11s today in terms of pronunciation. I'm convinced that I heard a chorus of angels as they left the room. Their first speaking test task under the new GCSE they found daunting, and their pronunciation was awful. I found it especially to be a problem as they'd learnt similar information for a writing task, which obviously impedes pronunciation in French. I spent the whole class working on sounds, and it worked brilliantly. This is from a head of languages in Spanish in Manchester. I found the introduction of phonics very effective, especially with year 6 and year 7, so pre-prep students, so sort of lower down school students who had been introduced to phonics in the early stages of primary tended to respond better. So again, reinforcing that point that I made earlier, that the earlier we start to do this, the better. I totally agree with the importance of getting the phonics right in language. I'm a further education adult language teacher who does lots of private work with teenagers, and it amazes me how they have never been taught any of the sounds in the French language, or only very basic ones. And then this is from the late Dr. Lynn Erler, who did an awful lot of solid research into the use of phonics in the languages classroom. She can be quoted as saying, we have to remember that some children get it very quickly. We were probably those children, given that we've gone on to become languages teachers. Teachers need to watch carefully, check who can and who cannot hear the sounds, compare and cross-link with how the child is doing in English. Making sound spelling links is a constrained skill, but once known, it just needs lots of practice. It doesn't need to be taught again. So that's it for me for today. I think I'm just running to time. I'm going to leave my contact details up there just for another minute or so. There's also a link to my Facebook page where if you want to follow what I'm doing with my consultancy Polyglot Language, then again, do feel free to click on those links. And the presentation has gone to several members of the ISMLA team, and I'm assured that that will be sent out to you in due course. So thank you for your time and for listening. I think if I just stop sharing now, if anyone has any questions or if anything has appeared in the chat, I'm more than happy to take those questions now. How are we doing, guys? Everybody being shy, or they're all just shattered from the first few weeks of being back at school potentially?
Okay, well, I think go on. Go ahead. I think I heard someone saying no.
No.
Okay.
Shy, please feel free to unmute yourself if you do have a question. I think. Oh, is there anyone? Oh, that's absolutely fine. Thank you for the thank yous in the chat, and hopefully there is quite a lot to take away. I did try and cram in what I've done in the past as a one-day course into an hour presentation, so I felt like I was going at speed at various points, but I just wanted to make sure that you got your money's worth. The video that I showed, the Spanish video, was on YouTube, yes. So when you get a copy of the presentation, anything that is underlined in pale blue is hyperlinked. So essentially all you need to do is click on that link and it will take you directly to the song or the website link that it refers to. So hopefully that's nice and clear. A virtual round of applause. That's very kind. Thank you, but not necessary at all. It's been an absolute pleasure. We've got some clapping symbols on the chat. That's lovely. Well, I will. I'll pause there for now, unless there are. I went to All Saints in York. There we go. It is a small world, isn't it, in the languages community? Please, I'm not just saying. Get in touch if you do want to contact me. Either do so via Guy or Kevin, and anyone through the ISMLA contacts that you have. Or if you did take a note of my email address or Twitter, I'm always more than happy to send on resources or ideas. It's always lovely to keep in touch with colleagues post events. Okay, well, I think it's definitely time for me to say a huge thank you to you, Suzi. It's absolutely fantastic, and thank you so much for everybody attending, and it's great to see so many positive comments back. I just personally what was just going through my mind throughout that is just really what probably such an integral part of language teaching phonics is, but probably that one area, as you pointed out quite a few times, that has been neglected or perhaps overlooked, and it's certainly given me a huge amount of food for thought for myself. And I think I'd sort of challenge anyone to say that they couldn't take away at least one takeaway from that
that presentation, and I think it's been fantastic just how much you've been able to pack in just from both the theory side of things, but also from actual practical ideas to go away and to integrate into our own teaching. So whether that be from a strategic point of view as a head of department, thinking about how you can maybe move phonics more formally into your teaching, or perhaps move it further down the school, whether it's a simple example of a task or something that you've for example, or a resource that you've suggested, like phonics fans or the posters in our classrooms. I'm sure everybody will be able to, from tomorrow onwards, be able to implement and improve their teaching in one way or another. So thank you very much.
I would say start small, you know, that there are lots and lots of takeaway ideas there. So don't try and do everything tomorrow. I think we need to be kind to ourselves in these strange times, but just, you know, pick out something that you think your students better than I do. So think about something that you think would work and slot in with the way that you already teach in your own unique style, and it would be great to hear how that goes. But thank you for your kind words as well, Guy, and thank you to ISMLA for the opportunity to share that with you. I hope to be back at some point in the near future.
Absolutely. I couldn't have thought of a better way to kickstart our webinar. So thank you ever so much. And as I say at the beginning, it's great to see such a mixed bag in terms of colleagues that have tuned in tonight. So thank you very much, and do spread that word far and wide to colleagues in prep and junior schools, whether that's your own school further down or colleagues in separate places, that we are very much looking forward to developing our offer in terms of supporting prep schools, but also, as you saw tonight, continuing to do that with our senior colleagues. So thank you very much, everyone.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, thank you very much again, and have a good end to your week. Bye now.